back, everyone. This is the symposium Harnessing Digital Technologies to Unpack the Dynamism of Human Interactions, which is being sponsored by the Center for Applied Second Language Studies over at University of Oregon. So we have as our organizer Julie Sykes from University of Oregon as well, and she will be presenting virtual reality for interlanguage pragmatic development across learning landscapes. We also have Stephanie Knight from the University of Oregon, vernacular digital games for interlanguage pragmatic development, and Christopher Derridix from also. Oh, I guess you are all from the University of Oregon. My apologies. Meta-pragmatic development through explicit mindfulness training, and lastly, Linda Forrest with assessing multiple dimensions of intercultural and pragmatic competence. So, without further ado, I will turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Francis, and everyone at the University of Arizona Circle in particular. We're delighted to be here. Just to sort of frame the symposium, we are going to do all of the talks concurrently with questions at the end, mostly for timing both at the end of the day and also just because all four of them really work together as one. They're really designed to talk about the trajectory starting from the very beginning all the way through to assessment and sort of what those look like. And I'll dig into that as we get going. Hello also to those of you online in the live stream. We'll just say hello. We don't get to see your faces, but we definitely like to give you greetings anyway. I wanted to start out with a recent quote by Thorne Swarwin Smith. The internet has qualitatively transformed everyday communication and constitutes a multiplicity of language contact zones that is unprecedented in human history. Likely, many of these contact zones have existed for a long, long time, even before technology, right? But the reality is they are more salient, they happen quicker, they're happening more and more and more. As a result, language teachers, language learners, people in general in the world have to pay attention more attention to the context that are happening, and the number of models, quote unquote, of what might be appropriate or not appropriate changes, expands. All the time, something is different. So part of what we try to do from the world of interlanguage pragmatics, one really critical component of intercultural communicative competence or intercultural competence, the language piece, right? What do we mean when we talk? What do we interpret in terms of meaning? Is understanding the skills and the strategies and the ways in which we use language to make things happen. And so this entire presentation really is focused on that. I bring to you a model from which we're working. Essentially what we did is we, in combination with the AELRC, Meg Malone and her team at Georgetown University, read through all of the models, there are about 57 of them now, of intercultural communicative competence, as well as heuristics around L2 pragmatic competence, interactional competence, and our goal was to pull apart what are the skills, what are the things that are actually measurable and accessible, and what of those elements actually are common across all of the frameworks that we see. So if our assumption is all of these have good to say, a lot of what's happening, right, in the theoretical world we talk about a lot, we've seen this a lot here, which models work, which don't, is figuring out these pieces. And this is what we came up with, essentially. Linda's going to talk much more about this in detail at the end. But our four really critical areas. Knowledge, so there's a certain amount of language knowledge you need to be good at pragmatics, right? You need to know how to change a conditional from a present tense, because that really matters when you're talking about a polite or impolite request, right? Analysis, the ability to analyze the language that's happening, the number of turns that are needed to say goodbye, for example. You might be perfect. Everything about your language, your words, your structures, your grammar, really could be perfect. And if you don't know you need to use those 3 times when you're leaving dinner, you're in big, big trouble. Right? You have to know when and how this works, and you have to be able to analyze that on the fly. That's what's really, really critical, right? The ability to analyze those pieces. On the other side of that, more of an affective side, the red, pinkish, and the greenish are the more active, effective pieces, right? Subjectivity. Learners have all kinds of choices, and we want to enable them to make those choices. And how does that become measurable, workable, et cetera? And finally, awareness. Just paying attention so that this matters in language. We were talking at lunch, Brian actually brought it up, and it sort of made me smile, I guess maybe is the right word, right? A student in Rob's talking about essentially like, I didn't learn any language, but I learned how to do all these things about being appropriate in context. And we were laughing like, actually, they learned tons of language. Every single thing that student is talking about is in this model. And so the idea is also just reframing a learner's idea of what it counts to learn language, which is much more than structures and words, right? Essentially, the standard word of what we see. So the objective of this symposium really happens in three ways. Considering the ways in which digital technologies can serve as catalysts, right? Digital technologies enable us to do things with teaching and learning we couldn't do 20 years ago, especially around pragmatics. One, learner exploration and reflection, the ability to do this sort of on the fly as we're working with it. Social change, to address ideas around social justice, really, really hard topics, in ways that are feasible in classrooms where there's all kinds of liability issues, et cetera. And the exploration of the dynamics of human interaction. We can use data on the back end, we can look at different pieces to actually understand how all of these things shift in and out of those pieces. As a result of this, then, for the development of intercultural communicative competence and interlanguage pragmatics. We're really going to focus in on the pragmatics piece, mostly because that's where we spend most of our time, but fully recognizing they're two sides of the same coin, right? They work together. Theoretically, we're very diverse in different approaches and the ways it works. Again, 57 models that are published as of today, maybe even more if something came out yesterday, for example. But figuring out where those pieces align. Francis did a great job introducing all four presentations. I won't go through their titles again, we'll just put them up there. But really moving from this sort of general idea about how do we even decide which pieces of this language stuff to teach, through specific classroom interventions, through disposition creation via mindfulness and some projects we're looking at through an interdisciplinary lens, and then finally, scalable, this is the key word here, scalable assessment using simulations to get at intercultural and pragmatic competence around this model of knowledge analysis, subjectivity, and awareness. You'll see, I hope, throughout the presentation, varied context and approaches. So we talk about classroom interventions, but we're also going to talk about social interventions, community reframing, different ways of thinking about language learning within the world. And so I'm going to start by talking about a project that is now concluded, actually. And I've talked about this project before, but not quite in this lens. And so I wanted to start with a question and pose it to you. And some of you, if you know what I'm going to say next, please, you don't have to share the trick. But why is it important to learn the alphabet? A shout out to any Muppets fans out there. Thought you might like this. But why is it important to learn the alphabet? You can take 30 seconds, kind of think about it. Can be very interactive, no problem. Anyone have an answer? To spell words? What else? Learn sounds. How many of you would say it's the most fundamental piece of language your students learn? Maybe? Yeah? What if I told you it meant the difference of getting to stay with your family or leaving your family? Getting split up or staying together, right? Then it becomes crucially fundamental to what's happening. And that is the case of what we see in this project. We worked with a company, Deutsche Telekom, out of Germany, to really look at what happens if we could use virtual reality for refugees in Germany needing to learn German for high-stakes reasons. It needed to be, and it was, function-based. It needed to have pragmatic variation at the core. What we found when we went in is that accuracy wasn't actually neither a goal nor something that would help in the long run. Learning the alphabet, you didn't need the whole alphabet. What did you need? What do you think? How to spell your last name. You had to be sure you could discern so perfectly the letters of your last name to match your children's last name, your spouse's last name, so that they all matched exactly right on the paperwork. Right? Super high stakes functional language use. Would the rest of the alphabet come later? Absolutely. Would we be doing a disservice to these learners by requiring the whole alphabet right up front? Probably. Also ensuring that proficiency certainly was a goal. So I'm not saying proficiency doesn't matter. I'm not throwing any of that, not the baby out with the bathwater, certainly. But thinking through, in this particular community context, the need for pragmatics to be right at the core. Finally, accessible to a wide variety of learners, and I'll talk about sort of the learner personas as we go. So the goal of this presentation, actually, my part, is not to talk about necessarily what the app was, what the virtual reality was. I'm happy to answer questions about the technology. But rather the ways and the intentional approach to thinking about what needed to be taught that's pretty distinctly different from what we typically build, even in our center, in lots of games, and language learning, everything we know about proficiency levels, whether it's SEFR, whether it's ACTFL, whether it's DLI, et cetera. So we started with some fundamental questions. Who are refugees? What do they need? How can we offer that to them, but more importantly, with them? We are not coming in to save something that's happening. We are there to offer a service in a way that matters. The reality is, we don't actually know, right? The majority of our empirical work does not address this context. We could replicate every study. Mostly we've replicated in typical classrooms. Likely we're not going to get the same outcomes in these particular populations or contexts. And so a lot of what we were doing is trying to figure that out. And here highlighting the fundamental importance of when we're designing, when we're implementing any types of innovations, whether they be games or digital technologies, that we really consider we don't actually know, even when the extreme might not be quite as far away as it feels in Germany. Perfect, thank you. We also need to be, really cautious to not assume our superiority in determining those needs. It's a really, really easy thing to do, especially in contexts of power or place. And so just imagining when we're thinking about this, just to be cautious. And so whenever I talk about this project, which is actually quite rare, I think I've given one other talk actually on this, is that just being cautious in those pieces. And so how did we do that? Our title looks kind of funny now that it's on this computer. But we really wanted to understand the needs, and so we went over to Germany. Our team really looked at what was out there, what was happening, analysis of policy and resources, the current curricula. There are already 19 programs that have been created specifically for refugees learning German. Site visits, we did interviews with all kinds of people in Germany, and also observations of what was happening. I got to sit in on a German class for females actually in the refugee accommodation, which was amazing, and then survey and user testing, and really robust around that area. And in that needs analysis, we had really 5 fundamental questions. 1, what is available? Who are the target users? How are these populations currently using technology? What ways can our project further their needs and their status? And who are the advocates as well as adversaries? I would say while these apply to this context, they should actually apply to any context that we're working with. So the more attention we start paying to student needs when we're creating digital technologies and these dynamics of human interaction, the more we get at the kinds of things we're hoping to get to in language learning curriculum. We're in the very, very initial stages of some community-based language learning in the local Eugene area. It's really the same questions we're asking. Who needs to learn language? Why do they need to learn them? How are they distinctly different from first-year university students completing a language requirement? And really utilizing technology to catalyze their language learning experience, even in spaces where traditionally they've been very unsuccessful. I hear it over and over. How many of you have heard it, right? I took a language course, I didn't learn anything, right? Our goal is to avoid those kinds of scenarios. What we know, current curricula, we looked across basically 7 dimensions, all 19 of the most prominent resources available. And kudos to Catherine Kaiser in our center for doing a lot of this initial sort of nitty-gritty work. And what we found, you can see by the red, here's what you're going to get. In terms of relevance of language contact, only 3 of 19, 15.7%, had anything we saw relevant to refugee populations. For example, taking a taxi. It's not actually something the majority of the, not all, and I'm really cautious to say this is a very heterogeneous group, right? Availability of pragmatic and cultural content in 7 of 19. So what I did when we went, the first thing we noticed right away, right? Request, politeness models were distinctly different between the groups of learners and the German population. And wow, no wonder there's clashes occurring, right? There's all these sort of pragmatic, what I call pragmatic flashpoints happening. And how do we get at that right away? The availability of strategic content, 0. In other words, how do you learn? Nothing there. Pedagogical method and mechanics, 2 of 19. Multimodality, about 42%. That's not so bad, right? We have listening, speaking, reading. Transparency, coherence, feedback, 2 of 19. Level of guidance, 7 of 19. So what do we take away from this? We had a long way to go, right? A long, long way to go. And what did we find out? That really the refugee populations in Germany specifically, we're guessing this is also true in refugee populations, at least that we've started sort of talking to, are most significantly through informal lessons, WhatsApp, Facebook, YouTube. Remember that initial quote? A multiplicity of contact zones unprecedented in human history. WhatsApp is fundamentally changing the way people are interacting with each other. Some of that's kind of scary, right? I enter my phone number, all of a sudden someone sends me 10 words a day. I wonder what's that tracking, what's that doing, right? So really thinking about what's happening in those places. Informal interactions with family members and peers, and then formal face-to-face classes, although in the case of Germany, that's only available to government-sponsored refugees who are primarily Syrian. We also were careful to take the time to construct user personas. So there are 2 here. I won't spend a lot of time on them. But just to sort of show how markedly different they are, both a female and a male version, right? A very highly proficient, technologically perfect, thank you. Highly proficient in terms of the technologies they use, highly relevant in terms of needing German to keep going, to get jobs, to wanting to sort of what we might call, in many cases, integrate, quote unquote, into the German world. Still sort of different in terms of the male and female version of those personas. And then a slightly older version maybe of that is what we might call the mother version or the forgotten. You can see as personas are typically written, the idea is to add some personality and some empathy into that. I do want to say these are not the only personas that exist, right? What we knew, there are millions of other ways that we can think about people in refugee populations. And anytime we say the refugee, we're making a mistake, right? The whole idea is it's the dynamics of human interaction. But what we did know is from a design perspective, if we could build a virtual reality learning experience that targeted the functional needs and also was helpful to the optimist as well as the forgotten, we would probably get 90% of the group, which was pretty successful considering the diversity of the group that happened. In truth, curricular-wise, I think we got there. Tech-wise, you know, partnerships are partnerships, and so we'll see how that all ends up. What this means, though, and what's important, and what my hope is that you take away from this particular talk isn't actually the project themselves, but is the idea that we need to use this information fundamentally for design. It means we need to connect to existing communities, and we need to spend the time to do that. We need to work both in low latency or non-connective environments, right? And imagine what that means then for virtual reality experiences, right? It has to work in both places. So some technological innovation that has to happen, multiple types of users and multiple user sign-in. Anyone guess why that's important? Seems like sort of a minor tech feature, but not really when we're talking about intercultural competence and understanding the group in which we're working. Anyone have an idea?
Can you phrase the question again?
Sure. Why do you think multiple user sign-in is a fundamental design feature of the curriculum itself and not just a tech feature? Exactly. Multiple people in one family using one device. We wanted to ensure that we acknowledge that as not as a reality, right? The reality is there's one device, and we need to ensure that you have access to this from wherever you are. So, you know, if I'm at home playing and then my dad wants to use the phone, I log out, he logs in, whatever that looks like. And so it's part of really understanding that user base. And then finally, ensuring it was designed for users who've experienced a high level of trauma, including colors that are soothing and avatar. One of our partners we worked with had a pretty strong psychological support background, and so working with those pieces. Again, examples of the kinds of design features that we were looking for and hoping for, and maybe likely not applicable across all learning contexts. but the process in which we went through, I think, has informed much of our work from here on out and thinking through what that looks like. And the projects that you'll see throughout the rest of the symposium are much more typical to what we see in classroom intervention projects or university-type projects, but all follow these same principles of designing for the user, ensuring we pay attention to that, and that the learners themselves can work with it. What does it mean for language instruction with interlanguage pragmatics at the core? Which is really the question we were asking, right? In this project, could we put pragmatics at the core instead of on the periphery? What do we see now in terms of pragmatics wherever we are? Oh, I'm going to give you a 5-minute cultural tidbit, right? When you're greeting, make sure you use formal or informal. 1 minute, perfect. Last slide. Also, maybe this is what I hear a lot. No, they do that abroad, right? When they go abroad, we'll get to pragmatics. But all the data bears out, we can start that a lot earlier. So what does this mean? If we are putting pragmatics at the core, one, adapting to the needs of the target learners by isolating flashpoints. Flashpoints meaning points of miscommunication. Everything else probably doesn't matter. Eventually it will matter. Absolutely. Eventually accuracy matters. But if we start at places that are actually causing miscommunication, we gain a great deal of sort of authenticity, I guess, for that learner, authenticated by them, of course. High-stakes curricular design decisions, and I'm going to say maybe not being afraid to make those decisions. We have a pretty strong tradition in language acquisition, right? And sometimes some of this work goes against some of that tradition, neither of which is empirically validated. And so ensuring that we at least take the time to empirically validate, or not, I'm okay with either one, but these ideas that we might get at a different space, right? Finally, and I'm going to say this again and again until we have a robust body of replicated studies in L2 pragmatic acquisition, but empirical research which addresses less accessible contexts, whether that's curricula that are designed differently, whether it moves away from textbooks, whether it's in places like Germany where refugees are learning, whether it's community language classes, doesn't matter. We need to understand more about these varied contexts as we move forward. Not all the projects we're talking about today are in those yet, but that's sort of the idea. At least take away from this initial experience from there. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Stephanie Knight to talk about digital games.